Good morning, Professor Sarah. Good morning,
Hi.
Professor.
Good morning, Professor Yang. Nice to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you. Okay, shall we start?
Yeah. I think I just first give
Okay.
some short introduction, then I will hand it over to you. Okay. Okay. So good morning, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar from Biodiversity and Ecosystem Specialized Committee of SIRE, so Asia Pacific Young Scientist Association. So my name is Susie Zheng Xueqin. So I'm the Assistant Director of the Asia Forest Research Center at UBC, so University of British Columbia. So I'm responsible to coordinate the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Specialized Committee. So AYSA is hosted by the Asia Forest Research Center, UBC Faculty of Forestry, so under the organization of APF-ECM. So it's an Asia Pacific forestry education coordination and mechanisms. So I will first introduce shortly APF-ECM in case you are not familiar with it. So this mechanism is initiated by the University of British Columbia and the Beijing Forestry University, supported by the APF-NET, the Asia Pacific Network for Sustainable Forest Management and Rehabilitation. There are 58 universities and organizations in the Asia Pacific region joined the mechanisms as members. So its objective is to develop concrete activities in support of the reform and improvement of forestry education in the Asia Pacific region. So the current chair and co-chairs of the APF-ECM are the University of British Columbia, Beijing Forestry University, and the University of Petra, Malaysia. So here, I also want to remind you, if you haven't done it, please register at our website and become a member of AYSA. So we will keep you updated by email on our events. So I will put the website link on the chat box later. So before starting our webinar, I want to inform everybody that this webinar will be recorded, and after editing, it will be available on our online video platform. For better sound quality, so I will mute your microphones except for the co-host during the presentation, so until our guest speaker finish his presentation. So in the question and answer section, you can unmute yourself if you have questions for our guest speaker. Or you can also send your questions by direct messages to our co-hosts in the chat box. So now I will hand it over to Professor Yang Xuefei, our Executive Chair of the Biodiversity Ecosystem Specialized Committee. So she will host the webinar today. Okay, thank you. Enjoy.
Okay, thank you, Xueqin, for the background information. Good afternoon to participants in Canada. Good morning to participants in China, and hello to participants in other parts of the world. Warmly welcome to join the AYSA seminar today. This is the second seminar we hosted in 2022. As Xueqin introduced, I'm Yang Xuefei, working at Kunming Institute of Botany, Chinese Academy of Sciences. I'm the executive chair for the Biodiversity and Ecosystem. As Xueqin already introduced, we hope that all of you have already registered as the member for AYSA, and I believe you will get lots of benefits, resources in your education, research, career development, and cooperations from this association. Before the seminar, I would like to introduce our three honorable participants for today. They are Wang Guangyu, Associate Dean and the Director of Asia Forest Research Center, Faculty of Forestry, UBC, and Ms. Yan Mei and Hu Chuyu, they from APNet Division of Capacity Building. We are delighted to have you here with us. And may I ask if you have any notes to deliver to our participants?
No. Thank you so much. Yeah. Good morning and good evening, everyone.
Okay. So if this is not the case, well, today it's our great honor to have Professor Sayer to give us a talk on people and biodiversity in Asia's forests in the 21st century. Professor Sayer has rich experiences of conservation in Africa and Asia countries. He was the backbone scientist for Iucn C4, James Cook University in Australia, focusing on the conservation and development researches. Currently, he is the professor at UBC. Now, let us welcome Professor Sayer for his great presentation. Yes, Professor, here, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I just have to now try and get my presentation onto the screen, which seems to have worked. I don't want that.
Yeah, it's worked well.
Right, I think it's been successful. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me. Yeah, and it's nice to see Professor Wang, Professor Guangyu, and Susie again, and everybody else. I'm very happy to have the chance to speak to you this afternoon, or this morning for some of you, I think. So what I thought I'd do with the time I have available this afternoon is to give you a few thoughts that I have on the discussions that are going on around the Convention on Biodiversity and the suggestions that are being made for things that the Conference of the Parties might decide in a couple of months' time when they meet in Kunming. I'm doing this because I hope that some of you might actually be involved in some of the negotiations and might have the opportunity to have some input, make some changes in those negotiations and make people aware of some of the scientific issues that I'm going to talk about. It's partly that, but it's partly because, as many of you are students, I'm going to reflect a little bit upon some of the things that you might think about in choosing how to spend your careers, and things you might do research on, things you might do to conserve Asian forest biodiversity in the future. So, excuse me, I've been on a long flight back from Asia, so now I've got a cold. You have to excuse me for that. So I'm going to give you a few, well, I thought, first of all, I'd start a little bit with some history of myself, of what I've got things overlying my screen, which are annoying. Right, yeah, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, just to introduce myself, to perhaps explain to you that I have not really been an academic researcher in my life. I've been much more involved in practical conservation things. So I spent the early years of my life working in protected areas in Africa and in different parts of Asia, in Myanmar, in Thailand, in Afghanistan, several other countries, Laos. And so I was working in the field doing practical conservation work. I then went to Iucn in Switzerland, where I led the Iucn Forest Conservation Program. I started it and ran it for 10 years, based in Switzerland, but with projects all over the world. I then went to the World Bank, where I was a senior environmental advisor for a time. But I wasn't very suited to working in a bank, so I didn't stay there for too long. I was then appointed as the first Director General of C4. So I moved to Indonesia and I started C4 and I ran it for the first 10 years. After that, I went back to Iucn in Switzerland and I set up a major program. At the time, it was one of the biggest programs that Iucn had ever had, which was called Landscapes and Livelihoods. And it was a program that attempted to sort of reconcile people's livelihoods with biodiversity conservation in about 27 different countries around the world. I then left Iucn and I went to Australia. And that was when I first went to a university. So I worked at James Cook University, and I got a big grant to try and do practical conservation work in the region, Southeast Asian region around Australia and Indonesia. So it was basically Southeast Asia focused. And again, it was working with graduate students, educating them, but also giving them practical experience of conservation work in the field. After that, I came to UBC 4 years ago, where I don't run, my wife runs a program in Master of International Forestry, and I try and help with that. And I have some graduate students and postdocs, and we do research, which is mostly in Asia, but a little bit still in Africa. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the issues that are being debated as we run up to the Kunming COP of the Convention on Biodiversity, and the big issues that are being debated in various sectors around the
Jeff, you mute yourself.
am I okay now? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, so my slides are not advancing now for some reason. Can you go backwards? Oh. Okay. So the concerns that I have around the discussions about the COP, or the particular things that I want to talk about today, are that there is a tendency for a lot of the debate to be about the size of protected areas. And this was true in earlier generations of discussions about biodiversity. So the Aichi targets, which were set in 2010 in Japan at the COP in Nagoya, targeted 17% of terrestrial land being put into protected areas. Before that, we had targets of 12% and 10%. So I'm going to discuss why those targets for the size of the protected areas, I think, are less important than targets that we ought to have for the quality of the protected areas, the ability they have to deliver the benefits that we want from them, to conserve species and so forth. I'm also going to argue that human societies are so diverse and they have quite different views on biodiversity that you can't have one solution for biodiversity everywhere. And at the moment, there's a bit of a tendency for the conservation NGOs in the rich world to sort of set the agenda and to raise the issues. And I think we have to have a process of setting that agenda which is much more egalitarian. So ordinary people in the places where the forests exist need to be part of that. So we have to let broad civil society decide on how they would like to see biodiversity conserved. So I think local context is incredibly important. So conserving huge areas might seem nice, but it's much more important to design conservation programs that fit the local context and meet the needs and expectations or gain the support of local people. So I'm going to give you examples of places where we've worked, where we've tried to do that. So finding local solutions, working in partnership, building collaboration, I think is more important than just targeting 20% or 30% of the land. And I think understanding what's causing change is really important. Understanding the processes that are going on, the social, economic processes that are taking place that will determine what the land is used for in the future. So these underlying causes of land cover change and the things that influence the behavior of people who cause that change to happen. So slow variables, things that we tend to react to immediate problems, but often there are longer term problems, like obviously climate change, like diseases, and invasive species, and economic things that are happening. If poverty is getting worse, then people are going to be less likely to want to conserve things. And if poverty is alleviated, on the other hand, you might have a better chance of people conserving things. So the work I'm going to tell you about is work that's done by my lab here at UBC, and we call the lab Vibrant Forest Landscapes. And you can go to this site and you can look at what we're doing. And Susie will make that available to you, I think, after this seminar. But the basic logic of our lab is that you can't conserve nature in places where people are very poor and getting poorer. You have to conserve nature in ways that is consistent with improving the livelihoods of the people in those places. And we often don't do that. A lot of external conservation actually deprives local people of access to resources and access to land. And that's not acceptable. That's not going to work in the long run. So our program focuses on tropical regions, on biodiverse tropical regions, and it's mostly places where people are very poor and nature is very rich. They're the sorts of places we try to work in, to try and find solutions so you can achieve conservation in those places and build the support of the local people. So we do in-depth studies in critical areas. We try and stay engaged in those places, and we use what we call transdisciplinary science, which is science that is conducted in collaboration with local people. They are part of the process. They are sources of information. They are people who are experimenting with us and learning together with us about what works and what doesn't work. So a lot of it hinges on long-term engagement and being really deeply engaged with local actors, getting to know them, becoming their friends, getting trusted by them, and letting them know that you're concerned about their well-being as well as the nature you're conserving. And from that, of course, we're scientists, we're in universities now, so we have to publish stuff and contribute to scholarship. So we also try and then draw out from these places some global generalizations, things that will influence policy, and we publish papers on that, and we can give you access to some of those publications also after this seminar. So the general approach that we use, and we've sort of been pioneers of this, is what we call a landscape approach. So the definition we use for a landscape approach is that it's a long-term collaborative process, that's collaboration with local people, which brings together the diverse stakeholders who are concerned with the landscape and works with them to try and achieve a balance between different objectives. And sometimes those objectives are conflicting. So local people may want more land for agriculture, and we maybe want more habitat for biodiversity. So these are all difficult things that have to be negotiated. And we do those in landscapes or seascapes, so large areas with mosaics of land cover. And we try and base our work, to some extent anyway, on the Sustainable Development Goals. So we obviously focus on SDG 15, which is life on land, which has a whole bunch of indicators about how biodiversity and forests are doing. But we also use the first 9 SDGs, the ones about basically based on human development, as a guide to us on how the people in the area that we're working in are doing. And we're really interested in SDG 16, which is about institutions and so forth, which means that we're really concerned about developing effective, accountable, and transparent institutions that can manage and ensure the governance of these areas so that the governance is fair and equitable and results in good biodiversity and good livelihood outcomes. So we want to ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels. So this is governance. So a lot of the work we've done recently is looking at the governance of landscapes and trying to put into place processes or governance processes that will meet conservation objectives and development objectives. So we face a certain number of realities in the world. So human pressure on land is clearly increasing. So one of the things that's been of concern to me is this idea that the Biodiversity Convention might aim to achieve 30% conservation of terrestrial areas by 2030. I think this is fine in a country like Canada, where I am now, or Australia, or even the USA. But in most Asian countries, that's a very unreasonable objective. You can't expect 30% of Bangladesh or Indonesia to be put into protected areas because there are simply too many people and too many demands upon land, and that pressure on land is increasing. So this is a reality that we have to be very conscious of. That demand for agriculture, biofuels, and land for urbanization is constantly increasing. So that's another pressure that we have to confront. The present approaches to conservation are often not working in poor countries because the people simply don't find them very interesting or useful. They don't bring benefits to the local people. And we need a lot more evidence when we start to intervene in these systems to make sure that what we do produces the right results. So we have to be very honest about assessing the impact of the things we're doing, and then adapting what we do so that we get the right outcomes for people and for nature. So when protected areas, simple, old-fashioned protected areas are the answer, we need much more information on how effective their management is, and we mostly don't have that now. So the country that I've been working most in recently, Indonesia, does have 22% of its land area in totally protected areas, national parks and equivalent reserves. But in many cases, there's a lot of local resistance to them and they're not particularly well conserved. There's a lot of encroachment, a lot of degradation in those areas. We need to be aware of this and measure it and react to it. So I think to do all these things, we need much more applied, again, transdisciplinary research which is on the ground by people from multiple disciplines, but who are engaged with local people and listening to local people and learning from local people. And that's what we try and do in our lab. And there are a few sort of overarching things that come out of all this that guide our work. One is that there's a concept of other effective conservation measures, OECM, that will be discussed in Kunming at the COP. And I think this is really important because there are lots of ways of conserving nature, and the old-fashioned sort of designation of 6 categories of protected areas by Iucn is not enough. We need to look at lots of other ways in which nature is conserved, and this term OECM, other effective conservation measures, is quite a useful shorthand term to cover all these other things, and I'm going to talk about them this afternoon. So a lot of conservation is inevitably going to have to be happening in areas where land use is integrated, where we're making multiple uses of resources and trying to do that in a way that's good for biodiversity conservation. So forestry and conservation can very often be, or industrial forestry or commercial forestry can often be integrated with conservation. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is to do with multifunctional land use and partnerships with local people, with industry, with whoever the competing users of the land are. And above all, we do have to address the needs of the people first. A lot of the people in many developing countries still suffer quite unacceptable levels of poverty. They don't have access to enough food, they don't have healthcare, they don't have education, they don't have running water, lots of things, they don't have infrastructure. All those things have to be met, those needs. So they have to be met perhaps first, but at the same time that we try and achieve our conservation objectives. So, my summary of that is that protecting 30% of all countries and all systems is not a very realistic objective. It's not even a sensible way to guide our work. There's a lot more that can be achieved by getting better quality protected areas in the right places and managing them well. And one of the papers that I've asked Susie to put on the website is one I wrote a long time ago about the value of small and medium-sized protected areas. And I still think that's a very important concept, that it's possible to achieve a lot with smaller protected areas if they're well managed and they're located in the right places. The second thing that doesn't receive enough attention in the CBD discussions normally is that there's there are many situations where you can achieve a lot of biodiversity objectives in multiple use areas. And the obvious example is forests that are subject to logging, but there's lots of examples. I mean, agricultural land with patches of trees and things like that. So that's an important thing to look at. The next thing is this whole concept of landscape mosaics. If those mosaics are well designed, they contain all the components that we need, they can make really good, they can provide a good balance between meeting people's development needs and meeting the needs of biodiversity conservation. And a lot of this can be done, and we try and do it, in areas that are managed by or in collaboration with local communities. So that for us is a really important objective. So I'm going to, so I have the principles that we try and apply in the work that we do in our lab are the following. We try and get involved in places for a long time. We're not very keen on aid agencies and NGOs that come into a place for a 2-year project or a 3-year project, decide what the problems are and work to try and solve them in a very short term. We think it's really necessary to be there for a long time in order to really understand what's going on and engage with local people and learn what the problems really are and what the possibilities are. So this is the transdisciplinary science part. It's about a very broad systems view of the whole landscape and all its biophysical and human and economic dimensions. So this is transdisciplinary science. It's all about learning together with people on the ground who actually make the decisions. We often can't make decisions for them, but if we learn together with them, we can suggest things, we can influence them, probably. It's about using, sorry, a spelling mistake, but using local knowledge, making sure we really have all the knowledge that's available in the landscape from local actors, and we use that in our work. And it's about negotiation, adapting things to local context, listening to people, learning from people, and so forth. And nudging. So this is a fashionable word in the world of business right now, and there's a book, I'll give you the reference at the end. But nudging means you're not planning or trying to take control of a situation. You're simply there as what we refer to as an external agent, and we're trying to influence the way people behave by suggestions and small contributions, small provision of information and things like that. So one of my last slides is a very nice book on this, which if you're interested in this, you might want to read. So I'm going to give you 5 examples of places where we've done things to conserve biodiversity and alleviate local poverty, and they were things that were not classic protected areas. They were different approaches. So the first one, for each one I'll tell you a little bit of the diagnosis, but this is a landscape in Central Africa. So this is the only example that's not in Asia, but it's such a nice example that I have to put it in here. So it's an area where I've been working now for more than 2 decades, and it's a spectacular area of rainforest on the border of the Central African Republic, Cameroon, and the Congo. And it's a place with amazingly rich wildlife. These are forest elephants, the pygmy elephants that live in the forest. In the background there, you can see vaguely some bongo, some antelopes that live in the forest. So this is an area, most of which has been given out for logging concessions. And a lot of people were very concerned that this logging was incompatible with conservation. So there was a lot of pressure to make the whole area into one big national park. But the problem was that pretty much the only source of income in the area, the only jobs for the local people, is in working in these forest industries. The only people who provide infrastructure, roads and healthcare and water supplies and anything else, schools in the villages, they're the forestry companies. And what we've discovered through being there for a long time is that the large mammals actually can do pretty well in these forests that are logged, because logging opens up the canopy, it lets more vegetation grow at ground level, and that's very good for some of these species like the elephants and the buffalo and other things that live in these forest habitats. And those logging roads, without them, we couldn't even get there, and with them, it's possible for tourists to get into the area. So these are the sets of problems that we were facing in this area. So we're concerned about logging. We've worked with the logging companies to try and get them internationally certified. And what we've tried to do is help them to log to high standards, standards whereby the biodiversity is protected, and let customers know that, so that customers see that by buying this timber, they're actually contributing to conservation. It's difficult to do that, actually. The customers don't believe us, and the activist NGOs tend to resist this, but this is what we have tried to do. So we've been out there, we've observed how the logging is done, we've tried to improve the quality of the logging, and we've tried to observe what happens to the biodiversity in the areas that are logged. So, you know, they get opened up, there's a certain amount of damage, but there's a lot of new vegetation, fresh growth, and a lot of wildlife comes into these areas. So animals like these pygmy forest elephants and the pygmy forest buffaloes, which you can, it's very difficult to see them anywhere else in Africa. In this place, you can really see them very well because you can get there and they are protected. The logging companies don't allow people to poach in this area. Although recently, with some of the instability in some of those countries, it has been quite difficult to protect the wildlife against armed people who come in from other parts of Africa. So in this area, you have things like gorillas. Now, gorillas especially do really well in forests that are logged, because when they're logged, you get a lot of palms and marantaceae and bananas and araceae, lots of these succulent plants that come up in the forest floor, and that's basically what gorillas eat. So these gorillas are really good evidence that logging is consistent with conservation of these species. And we've actually found that there are more gorillas and elephants and buffalo in the logged forest than in the forests that are not logged, because the habitat is not so good for them when it's not logged. So this is, you know, I have a huge debate at the moment in British Columbia about old growth forests. So I'm very keen that we should have a reasonable number of old growth forests in all our conservation programs. But for some species like these gorillas and elephants and buffaloes, old growth forest is not the best habitat. Opened up forests, successional forests are much better. So that's my first example. Now I am going to move to Asia, and I'm going to talk a bit about an area where CIFOR has worked for a long time, where I'm still engaged in what is now North Kalimantan in Indonesia. So this is an area which CIFOR selected as its research forest in the early 90s. So I've been going there now for almost 30 years. At that time, it was a forest frontier. There was nothing happening there. There were just vast areas of natural forest, but we knew that logging was going to arrive. We knew that roads were going to be built, and there were people there, Dayak communities living out in the forest, mostly practicing shifting agriculture and a bit of hunting and gathering. We were concerned that whatever development took place would be good for those Dayak people. We knew that oil palm could grow in this area, and there was a potential for very large-scale oil palm expansion. And we knew that there was coal there, and there would be coal mining. And we were generally concerned that new infrastructure was going to open up the area for all sorts of other developments that might be bad for forest ecosystems and for biodiversity. And recently, there's been a lot of suggestions of hydroelectric dams and aluminium smelting, which could have a huge impact on the area. And the new Indonesian capital city, if it's built, will be not very far from this area. So it's an area that when we started was pretty pristine, but where we knew then there was a likelihood of very significant change. And we wanted to understand that change and see how that change could be maybe mediated a little bit, not allowed just to run its course, but done in ways that would maximize the benefits for the local people and retain as much biodiversity and natural forest as possible. Previous slide. Yeah, so it's a pretty nice area. This is how you get there. You have to go on boats up these rivers. It's a pretty special place. We've been taking students there, and I love to go there. And that's me in the forest. That's a bit that hasn't been logged. So we've become quite committed to trying to conserve this forest, and we've developed a lot of links with the people there. My wife did her PhD there, working with the hunter-gatherers, the Punans living there. And the landscapes were very diverse, even though there were very large areas of fairly undisturbed forest, there were people practicing shifting agriculture, collecting non-timber forest products, hunting, gathering, doing the sorts of things that these forest communities have been doing for a long time, without really doing a lot of harm to the forest or the biodiversity. So they left behind them these areas of natural regeneration, which made the forest more diverse, but there was probably a greater range of biodiversity than there would have been if the forests had been totally undisturbed. So one of the reasons we talk about this area is that we've been taking students there for a long time. There are lots of students who've done PhDs and master's degrees there. And this was our last visit when we took quite a lot of students. That was before we came to UBC, but we're going to take UBC students this year to work in that area. And because we've got now some 25 years of data and 25 years of friendship, it's possible for us to go there and learn a lot and do a lot rather easily. We have lots of background data and maps and all sorts of things. So one of the big threats to this area was thought to be the expansion of oil palm. We even built some simulation models to show what would happen to people's livelihoods and to the forest, obviously, and the biodiversity if oil palm expansion happened on a very large scale. And generally, the conclusion was that that was not going to be very good for local people, and it certainly wasn't going to be very good for the forest. So we studied options, we modeled what would happen with different percentages of the landscape converted to oil palm. And we published a paper, which has had a little bit of attention, where we argued that if oil palm was done in the right way, with proper governance, proper measures to involve local people, then you could have quite a lot of oil palm, you could get all the development benefits and the jobs that people need, and you could still achieve conservation objectives. And I still believe that is generally true, and is something that we should, we shouldn't be opposing oil palm, we should be supporting oil palm done in the right way. In practical terms, what happened here was that we encouraged some of the local people, when they cut their shifting agriculture patches, to plant a few oil palm trees afterwards and then maintain those trees, so that instead of having these huge monocultures of oil palm, they had their agroforests with a certain amount of oil palm, and they could harvest the fruits and take them in their boats down the river to a little mill that was built. And they got a good income over a long period of time, but they retained a lot of forest in their landscapes. So the solution we came up with was that this area, it does need to have some small, totally protected areas, a mosaic of small areas, but oh, sorry, I thought I was going to have some more, but anyway, and some oil palm and a bit of everything in the landscape, but the total area that needs to be totally protected was relatively small. Now, my second example is the island of Seram in eastern Indonesia, in the Malukus. So our sort of diagnosis of this area, this is a spectacularly beautiful island. It's one of the biggest islands in Indonesia. It's about 700 kilometers long, and it's very forested. It's the most forested island in Indonesia, and the people are rather poor. They're poorer than average in Indonesia. And it's very mountainous. It's very beautiful. So our diagnosis of the problem was, well, it's got incredibly high levels of endemism. It's never been connected to Asia or Australasia. So everything that's there evolved locally. So a large proportion of the birds and the plants are endemic, and there are relatively few mammals. The only mammals are things that fly or that people have brought there. And it's in pretty good shape. The people are really poor. If you score them on the SDG indicators, they come out lower than most people in Indonesia. And there are all sorts of development. And gas in the east of the island. There's oil palm in the north of the island. There's big sugar estates being built in the west of the island. These are all by international investors. And there's cacao, chocolate, in the northeast. So all these things are happening, and they provide jobs, and they put money into the community, and the government's building roads to access all these things, and it's putting in fiber optic internet connection. So a whole lot of things are happening, which means this island is not going to stay in its pristine natural state forever. It's going to change. And other new agricultural concessions are being put in, inevitably. And it would be, foolish to think this is not going to happen. So we have to have a solution for biodiversity that is consistent with all these things. So this is the biodiversity. It's especially the birds. It's amazingly rich, amazingly interesting, and you can actually see all these things there. They're quite spectacular. The people live in these very simple houses, a lot of them along the coast, but some of them way up in the mountains. And we have sort of been examining with the people the possibility that they might manage these forests themselves, because they already have for a long time been extracting all sorts of products, non-timber forest products from the forest. And maybe they can do that in a sustainable way, which means that they have an interest in maintaining the forest. And in particular, that nutmeg is a big crop. This is where nutmeg originated. Nutmeg's still a profitable crop, and the people have always harvested it. And it grows in mixed forests. And those mixed forests are really good habitat for many of these species of birds and other things that are there. So they're very biodiverse forests. So there's a compatibility between living off a harvest of nutmeg and keeping your biodiversity. So our proposed solutions, these are very brief summaries of what are complex things for this area, is that you have these agroforestry systems, multifunctional agroforestry systems. They're managed by local people. And we have a concept called a critical ecosystem. So anybody from Indonesia who's listening will know what a KAA is, a critical ecosystem zone. So we have talked with government about designating some of these areas as critical ecosystems because they can't be made into national parks or reserves because people would lose their livelihoods, but they can be managed more sensitively to make sure that the ecosystem values are retained. And I get back to my other effective conservation measures. So things you can do other than total protection that would be with maintaining the biodiversity. So this OECM is definitely something that's going to come up in the CBD COP discussions. And there are lots of scientific challenges around this. I'd like to really emphasize that people who are going to do research, PhDs and things on things related to forest conservation, and studies of these other effective conservation measures, there's a whole lot of things that need to be done there that are really interesting. So there's another very small island near there that I've become quite interested in. It's Buano Island. It's little, it's very poor. I'm interested in it because I like birds, and there is a bird on that island, the Buano monarch, which only exists on that island. There's only about 100 to 200 left in the world. They're critically endangered. They're one of the world's rarest birds on this little tiny island with these very poor people. And the local people would not at all want us to make a national park there or a nature reserve because it would deprive them of their livelihoods. So we have to work out some way that this bird can be protected, can survive, and not do that in the face of opposition for local people, do it in a way that supports them. So again, this is the other effective conservation measure concept and the need for research, which we haven't done. We're still writing up some work and continuing to do some work there. But we spend time on the island. This is a fabulous place to visit. Again, this is a lot of our students, some of whom are now at UBC. I think most of them are at UBC, working in the area. And it's pretty tough to get there. It's pretty tough when you're there. So these are our people, plus local villagers, plus people from the government conservation agency in the province. Now, this is the problem. The problem is that the people on the island, their only real source of cash income is distilling essential oils from the leaves of melaleuca trees. So they have these plantations of melaleuca, and they harvest the leaves. That in itself is not such a problem because the plantations are quite small. The problem is that they have to distill the oil out of those leaves in these big wooden casks, and they have to have firewood to boil the water. The leaves have to be boiled in water for about 2 days to extract the leaves, to extract the oil. And harvesting the firewood to do this is a big problem because there is simply not enough forest left to produce that amount of firewood. So the challenge is to find some way either of getting them to grow more firewood or use some other form of heating to distill the oil, or do something different. Otherwise, the forest is going to disappear and their livelihood will disappear and the birds will disappear. So that's a problem that we're still confronting. We haven't found a good solution because COVID came along and we haven't been able to go there for a couple of years. But it's typical of the problems that you find on these very small islands. It's not simple to find a solution that will conserve these rare species, but will not have a negative impact on the livelihoods of people. So what we think for that island is that some sort of community managed mosaic might work. That we're working with the local university to try and study the options for the island. We have local researchers working there. We have an ethnobotanist going there who's supervised by us, a PhD student who's going to look at exactly how people use the landscape and value it. And we're looking at the possibility of small and medium forest enterprises that might provide local jobs and local income, maybe just cultivating this oil or doing something else with the forest. And we're trying to sort of not impose a solution on people, but try and understand what's going on with change and how we can use this concept of nudging, just having a little influence. We can't control what happens, but we can try and encourage people to take certain solutions. So this nudge thing that I'll get back to at the end of my presentation. We've been doing also some other things that have been quite useful in all these landscapes. We've found it very interesting to use actor network analysis to understand who's making decisions and who's influential and so forth. And we have theories of change, which we develop with local people to try and help us understand how we can influence change. My last example is a surprising one. This is in Sumatra, and this is a major industrial development. This is, I think, the world's biggest pulp and paper mill, certainly the biggest one in the tropics. It's a huge thing and it's very successful. It's ultra modern, state of the art, and it's now aspiring to be not just it started off as a mill producing kraft pulp. Now it's more of a biorefinery producing lots of other products. And it's got a lot of criticism because it's gone into an area where there was lots of natural forests, and the activist NGOs have been critical of it for having negative impacts on those forests and possibly negative impacts on some of the local people. So our diagnosis of the problem is that there's going to be partnerships with people, with the industry. We can't work independently of them. So we have become engaged with them. I now chair a committee that advises them on their environmental and social impacts. They have a net zero goal. They need to do this to reduce their carbon emissions in order to access money from the global banking system. So they agree with us that they should be doing things to reduce carbon emissions from their landscape. And they also have, a corporate social responsibility. They want to do things to be seen to be good citizens. They want to be liked by local communities and do positive things for the landscapes where they exist. And they're a big company, so they have resources and capacity to manage land, to protect things. And if they decide to do something, they can do it. They also need a sort of license to operate. They've been criticized for their environmental impacts. They want to be seen to have good impacts. So they're doing all sorts of positive things. So the habitat, the solution we've come up with is that they are going to have 50% of their concession they've got about 1 million hectares in habitats that will be restored. So a lot of them are already in the process of being restored. So in these areas, natural forests will regenerate. These are all on peat. A lot of these are on peatlands. And one of the problems is that when the peatlands are exploited, the peat oxidizes, so you lose carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So the intention is to keep 50% of the area under natural forest so that it will continue to sequester carbon. So it will offset the carbon losses from the part of the estate that is managed. So restoring the habitat means you sequester carbon, and we've got them to agree that they will have 1 hectare of natural forest sequestering carbon for every hectare of plantation forest where we all know you're going to lose some carbon. They're trying overall to make their whole operation carbon neutral or carbon positive, so they're very efficient in the use of solar electricity, all sorts of things that can reduce their carbon emissions. And they are moving towards higher value products, so particularly viscose, which is worth a lot more than kraft pulp, and they market that internationally for clothing. This is good clothing because most of our clothing is polyester, and of course polyester is based on fossil fuels, and polyester breaks down into microplastics, which are bad for our health and bad for the oceans and everything else. We also encourage them to create as many local jobs as possible and drive growth in the local economy, and to favor small and medium enterprises in the region to provide various raw materials and inputs to their company. So that's our scenario for that area. And the governance of these things is a really important element. So we've been doing work on governance. So in all the 5 landscapes I've shown you and others, we have people doing research. We have master's students and PhD students doing research, and research that contributes to this understanding of the systems to improve their sustainability. In this case, a lot of the research is focused on how the landscape is governed. So they're my 5 examples. I'm just going to give you now a few general points about these landscape approaches. So I think in these landscapes, you have to be there for a long time, and you have to develop relationships, and it takes a long time to really understand the context and the drivers of long-term change. So that's a major objective, is simply to get to know people, understand long-term change, and build up enough trust so that people will be interested in what you have to say. Really engage with actors on the ground, use their knowledge. We're working with them to try and build understanding and build up knowledge. And so that's a fundamental element of our contribution. Work with those people to experiment, to try things and see if they work, see if they produce good outcomes for people, and see if they produce good outcomes for biodiversity. Try and optimize these benefits for society, looking at the local needs and seeing if those local needs are met, and because they don't necessarily are not the same as the public goods values of carbon sequestration and biodiversity. So what we're trying to do overall is, in these landscapes, achieve some practical conservation and development outcomes. So we're not primarily there to do research, we're primarily there to solve problems. And if we succeed, or even if we don't succeed and we understand better, then we write this up and we publish it to make sure there's a permanent record and that other people can benefit from what we've done. So we use this term learning landscapes. We have sentinel landscapes where UBC and our partners work together. And maybe other people in other parts of Asia might like to sort of emulate some of these things we're doing and do similar work in landscapes. And we have some preliminary activities in a number of places. One thing we've talked about is that there might be some sentinel learning landscapes scattered along the Belt and Road Initiative in the countries where the Belt and Road Initiative is going to build infrastructure, so that we could achieve conservation outcomes in those places that the Belt and Road Initiative is going to penetrate. So more information on this is on this website, which I mentioned at the beginning, which you can access if you want to. We also have a small local NGO in Indonesia, which does, is the host for our work in Indonesia. So I said we've published more general outcomes. So we did a paper in the Proceedings of the Natural Academy of Sciences, which outlines our approach to landscape approaches, what the principles are for landscape approaches. And this paper has been very widely cited. It's become a sort of guideline for people doing landscape approaches. And it's now, yeah, maybe it's a bit out of date. We published this 10 years ago. It's about time we revisited it and perhaps rewrote it to incorporate some of our learning. But at the moment, it's still there, and it's a reasonable guide to what we do. And then I have just a few papers on generic things which are important. So, you know, we're going to do this work at landscape scales. You need to have some way of measuring your impact. You need metrics for whether you're being successful or not. So we've published quite a lot of papers. This is one on assessing the environmental and development outcomes from conservation landscapes. Another example is how you can how you can get a balance between conservation and development. Some general lessons on that. So improving the effectiveness of interventions that are trying to balance conservation and development, a conceptual framework for that. And we've written a couple of books, and we need to do some more because these are also getting a bit old now. So the Science of Sustainable Development documents a lot of our experience in these landscapes, and the Forests in Landscape book covers our experience in a number of countries, including some Asian countries. And this is it, the final thing. A couple of books that have been very influential recently in our thinking. This book, Nudge, by Taylor and Sunstein. These are sort of New York Times bestsellers, but it's a really interesting book, mainly by an economist, but it sets out better than I can the theory of how we try to be in these landscapes and influence how they develop. And The Building State Capability is a World Bank book about their learning from how they try and build capacity in countries to do things. And that's where we get this idea of being an external agent and peripheral agent. We're not, the World Bank often does want to control things. We think, and some of them think, that you can't do that. It's not our role to do that. But you can contribute knowledge, ideas, motivations, and influence people in a positive way to achieve better balanced outcomes. So that's it. These final words. Well, they're not coming up. I have some problems with this thing. So yeah, my summary is that we're going to, oh, well, I've lost it completely now. I don't know how that happened, but maybe that was my penultimate slide anyway, and I've probably talked for too long, so I will stop. But my basic message is that I think that what's being discussed for the CBD needs to be much more nuanced. It's not just getting more protected areas, it's getting better protected areas. And the message maybe for the younger scientists is that there are huge research challenges and huge job opportunities in trying to do this work throughout the world, but in the Asia-Pacific region, so that we find good local solutions to conservation problems in areas where development is going to happen and biodiversity could be lost. So we're looking for options so that the biodiversity does not get lost and development does happen in a way that's sustainable. So thank you very much indeed, and I apologize for the misbehavior of my PowerPoint thing, but I only missed one slide, I think. So back to you, Professor Wang. Jan.
Okay, Professor Wang, probably you have some remarks first.
No, I was just so amazing. Thank you so much, Jeff, for the excellent talk and the 5 excellent case study. So I just wondering, how can we develop the a good relationship with the local people as a PhD student working for some area? It's very difficult for them to get that kind of relationship, though. Is there any suggestion from you? I know we did a lot of research with national park, and I think that partnership or trust is very important to develop with. Any suggestions?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That is a challenge. And maybe in some situations it's not an easy challenge to meet. I think part of it is patience. I think not going in suddenly and announcing you're going to change everything, but just going in and building relationships and hanging out with people for a time, getting to know them, attending their ceremonies, living close to them. I go out on hunting trips with them or fishing trips, and I'm sort of interested in what they do. But the main, and I have the advantage that I have sort of gray hair, I'm older, so they tend to be quite respectful of me. And my wife is an anthropologist, and she likes to talk to them at length. So she's quite happy to sit in the village and talk to people for hours and hours and hours and get to know them and get involved in all their social interactions. But you have to do that. So we use the term inductive research. So you don't plan your analytical framework and your conceptual frameworks too much in advance. You go in there. I mean, we know these places are important. We know certain things about them, but you go in there with a very open mind. So you go in with your eyes and ears open and your mouth closed for the first period. Don't tell them the answers, but just try and learn from them. But it's a question of attitude, and some people seem to do it much better than others.
Yes. Yeah, particularly we are all the young scientists here. They need to do research. Need to build a very good relationship. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Sayer, for the very wonderful and very informative presentation. I personally really enjoyed because my background is ethnobotany. So I really have lots of feeling and for that. And I would like to ask you a question. What do you think the biggest challenge for upscaling this local good practices for conservation, especially with the integration of local needs to the global generalization? Yeah, that's my question.
I think that's a very good question. And I don't have a simple answer, but I do think that places like the CBD should recognize this need for locally adapted solutions. That the solution, the role of the CBD is not to tell us we have to have 30% of the world in totally protected areas. The role of the CBD should be to insist that governments build the capacity and have the institutions that can handle these things. So we need institutions at all scales. We need them at local scales, and the national level institutions need to be respectful of the learning that's coming up from below. A lot of conservation planning at the moment is very top down. You know, central agencies who go to the CBD, they decide what should happen and they tell people on the ground what ought to happen. And it shouldn't be that way. They should be listening to the people on the ground and condensing all that knowledge that's coming upwards from people on the ground, and then creating a general policy framework that allows appropriate things to happen. You know, letting 1,000 flowers bloom. Every site is different. Every solution is going to be different. And the tendency of international conventions is not to do that. It's a sort of one size fits all stereotype. So I think it's a behavioral thing. I think people who go to those negotiations, who are part of these international processes, have to be much more sensitive to those on the ground realities. We always insist that our students go and live in villages and share living conditions with local people. And I think that's really important in changing their attitude. And I was very impressed when, I think his name was Wolfowitz, a new head of the World Bank in about 20 years ago. He announced when he got to the World Bank that everybody on the World Bank staff should go and spend a month every year living in one of the villages where the World Bank was trying to solve development problems. Of course, nobody in the World Bank wanted to do that, and they didn't. He didn't last very long at the World Bank, but I thought that was a really good piece of advice that people should have followed, because so many of those people in senior positions taking high-level decisions have not had much exposure to the realities on the ground for many years in many cases. So there is a whole change in attitude required, much more sensitivity to local situations and appreciation of the diversity of local situations, question of learning and so forth. So it is, the question you raise is absolutely fundamental.
Yeah, thank you for the nice answer. And do we have any questions from our audience? Yes, please, Mr. Pan Yong first, and then Wen Huan.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Yeah, it's a very interesting talk. I'm Pan Yong, come from the Chinese Academy of Forestry. So in Jeff's talk, it's very interesting, to bring some ideas how to balance for the local people's development and the biodiversity conservation. So for my question is, what is the optimal forest composition structure for a certain region, like an island or a mountain area? Because you also mentioned that we for the different purposes we need like old growth forest and the secondary forest and even some plantations or cash forest for the local people. But what is the optimal or ideal spatial mosaic or the distribution? All of this can we consider for this different purpose?
Well, again, I think there's no single answer to that question. It is a fundamental question in any place that you might end up working that you would need to address. And I think these landscape approaches attempt to do that, to work out what would be the best solution. But it's really interesting because at the moment here we have a major debate in British Columbia about old growth forests. That all the conservationists, all they want to do is conserve as much old growth forest as possible. If possible, they'd like the whole province to be covered in old growth forest. And for me, that's a total misunderstanding of what they should be wanting. You have to have much more specific biodiversity targets. You must know which species and which ecosystems you're most concerned about. And in many cases, the best strategy will not be an old growth forest. It will be exactly what you said. It will be a mosaic of different successional stages of forest. So as a naturalist, when I go into the forest, I don't necessarily spend a lot of time in the old growth forest. I'm generally very interested in the edges of the forest, the ecotones, and successional stages. So a mosaic with young forests and middle-aged forests and so forth is best. And where the balance lies will depend on which species you're most concerned about. So here in British Columbia, you can argue that for caribou, you do need quite a lot of old growth forest because that's where the lichens that the caribou eat live. But for other species, for lots of forest birds, you need early successional forest. Many of these migratory birds do well in young forests. So I think it's exactly the point I raised. You need lots of PhD students out there studying this very issue and working out what the best solution would be. And you need empirical evidence for what happens under different systems of management. So I was brought up in Britain where we didn't have hardly any natural forest at all, and we had a lot of successional forest. And I grew up appreciating the values of those forests, the biodiversity of those forests. They were very important. People in North America, of course, have started off with quite a lot of natural forests, so they have a different appreciation of those early successional stages.
Yeah, okay, yeah, thank you. And also especially, when we consider for the multiple different species, maybe they have like mammals and the birds, they have different preference for the habitats. So maybe it's even more difficult.
The majority of large mammals don't do very well in old growth forests. They prefer forests that are opened up. And there are also issues to do with fire. Certain stages of succession are more or less susceptible to fire. There's a question of diseases, especially these invasive species and invasive pathogens now, different stages of development. If all your forest is uniform, the same age, then you're going to be very susceptible to fire and to fungal diseases and things like that. If you've got lots of different age categories and mosaics, then you're much more likely to have significant areas that survive any of these catastrophic events. So the present preoccupation with old growth forests, in my view, is a symptom of a ecological illiteracy of many of the environmental groups. They simply don't understand enough about forest ecology to know what they're talking about.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Maybe I may have one more question. Maybe not. It's not a real question, but last week there was a rainstorm and landslide disaster happening in Brazil. It's also caused over 100 people die. Because it's also in tropical area where you have many experience in tropical forest research. Could this relate to the deforestation, happened in Brazil during the past year?
Well, that's a big issue here as well, because we've had a lot of flooding and landslides just about 3 or 4 months ago. Did a lot of damage, and there was a lot of discussion about the extent to which that was caused by bad logging practices. And in some cases it may have been, but some of our scientists have shown that it depends how much rain you get. Beyond a certain amount of rain, in these very extreme rainfall events, it doesn't actually make much difference what the condition of the forest is, because its capacity to absorb that rain is completely overshadowed by the amount of rain. That may be the situation in Petropolis in Brazil, I don't know. But that was probably the situation here. We had unprecedented amounts of rain. That much rain falling in 24 hours hadn't happened before. And when that happens, you're going to get landslides, and you're going to get, it's a natural phenomenon, you're going to get floods. Of course, with intermediate amounts of rain, then it does matter a lot what the forest cover is. And bad logging or bad forest management can be a contributing factor. Again, it really requires a lot of local knowledge, good foresters on the ground who are aware of the risks of different things that happen. So some examples here, it was fairly clear that bad logging practices and bad management of logging roads and skid trails and things had contributed to these big problems. So we're learning those lessons now.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So next one, we got Mr. Xu Wenhan, please.
Thanks for Jeff's excellent presentation and with wonderful pictures. I would like to ask a question. I think it's very good while people are talking about biodiversity, you are acting biodiversity, and you chose the 5 cases to discuss, and also you present the problems and the resolution. But I was wondering why you choose those 5 cases, those 5 places. Are there any common points or any particular interest on those places?
Yeah, I mean, it was a fairly personal thing. So I could have talked about other places, but those 5 places are ones that I'm particularly interested in, where I've had students working and where I have some nice photographs. So I wanted to choose ones where I could show you some nice photographs. But they were also designed to cover this sort of range of different types of situation that we're working in. And, and to really emphasize the fact that simply fencing off an area and making it a national park and then assuming it's just going to stay the same and investing all your money in chasing away the local people, stopping them going there, and putting them in prison if they go and do anything wrong there, that's not really what we advocate. So I could have chosen other examples, but I chose those ones because they're really, really nice places to work in, really beautiful places. And we've been working in them for a long time. So we've had plenty of time to learn the lessons of what was going on. So what I'm trying to do now, when I find the time, is write up some of these long-term case studies, because a lot of publications are based on a 2 or 3 year study of a place. So we have now a series of studies by different members of our team over quite long periods in some of these places. And what we find is that when you start, you think you know what all the problems are, but the longer you stay, the more you realize that they're actually, the real problems are quite different. there are other things happening that you only learn about gradually with time. So what I'm going to write about is what really causes change. And it's often not the sort of short-term things that capture the attention of environmental groups. It's often other things that are going on behind the scenes that you don't notice. So that's my sort of retirement project, to write some stuff about that. So I just spent 2 months in Indonesia collecting a bit of information on some of those places. So that's also why I used those photographs, because I was in some of those places quite recently.
Thanks very much. I'm the first year PhD student in Dr. Wang Tongyi's lab. So do you have any suggestions about something forestry management? Because my focus will be forestry management and how to use that to mitigate climate change and also biodiversity, anything about that. So I think your presentation covered a lot of topics, animals, agriculture. Do you have any specific suggestions for forestry management and how that could be a good measurement to protect the diversity and conservation?
So whereabouts are you doing that research? In which forest, which country?
My particular interest is about China, because China have a lot of plantations. You know, plantation will sort of reduce the biodiversity, but also protect some areas, because some areas are disaster or without any plant. But plantation sometimes also protect the environment, but sometimes reduce the biodiversity.
Yeah, I think, again, that's a really interesting question. And I don't think I can do justice to it now. It's too complicated. And there are too many situations to talk about. But, well, one thing that springs to mind is that my most cited paper of all my papers I ever published is about biodiversity and plantations, because I did a study with some colleagues and we found an amazing amount of biodiversity in plantations in different parts of the world. And that was quite surprising for many people. And so it's a publication that we did about a decade ago that a lot of people have referred to. So you can't assume there's no biodiversity in plantations. But of course, the real issue is to get a mosaic again, to have, I think maybe it wasn't very clear, but in some of those slides towards the end of my industrial pulp and paper business in Sumatra, you could see that there were very nice mosaics of natural forest within the plantations. And those natural forests are quite well connected amongst themselves. There are corridors and linked areas of natural forest. And a lot of the biodiversity exists at the edge between the natural forest and the plantation. And we have tigers there. The tigers like to live in the natural forest, but they go out and catch monkeys and pigs in the plantation forest because it's easier to catch them there. So there are things like this that you can learn by studying these things. And because they're plantations, there tend not to be poachers there, so the tigers are safer. So yeah, I'm very keen on mosaic landscapes, different types of forest cover and different ages of forest. And I think given the situation in China, where clearly there's not going to be that much natural forest and there's going to be a lot more plantation, then getting natural forest set-asides and corridors and edges and things and riparian strips into those plantations could have major biodiversity benefits. So perhaps if Guang Yu invites me to come and have coffee with the people in his lab one day, I'll bring you some of these publications and we can talk about this a bit more.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. And now we have the two requests. One is from Mr. Luo Yixin, then after that, Mr. Ranyo. Okay, so now it's time for Luo Yixin. Can you?
Hello, hello, can you hear me? Yes,
Yeah.
thank you, Professor Yang and Professor Serre. Thank you for your excellent presentation. From what I gathered from your presentation, is that people should put human needs, the livelihoods of local people first, and have integrated land management, while also striving for conservation of biodiversity and also balanced carbon sequestration. But from what I believe is that it is very difficult, especially if we have to consider human livelihoods and development to, let's say, restore biodiversity to before it was when humans started intervention and disturbing the ecosystem, because humans have been living in this world for a very, very long time. And we have already put our footprint in the world. So in conservation work, I would like to ask, what is your ideal of the ultimate goal of conservation biodiversity-wise? Because I feel like it would be almost impossible to lift every single species out of the endangered species list. There will always be species that do not have very big population numbers. So what state of biodiversity do you think that conservation work should work towards? Like the extent of how much we should restore their natural habitat, or like the numbers or stability of their populations, size, and stuff that conservation and restoration workers should work towards. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. Again, it's an excellent question, but it's not one that's very easy to answer. It reminds me of the very first big international congress that I went to on conservation a long time ago, was focused on choices. We debated then the fact that a lot of species were going to go extinct. We couldn't conserve everything, and we couldn't conserve all habitats, so we had to make choices. And at that time, we could have a serious discussion about the fact that we had to set priorities. And nowadays, I think there's a reluctance to do that, to acknowledge that it is inevitable that a lot of ecosystems will decline, will be lost, and a lot of species will be lost. But it is a reality. If we're going to have 10 billion people on the planet, and they all aspire to live like the people in Vancouver, with a very high footprint, with huge consumption of natural resources, then there's going to be less biodiversity than there would be if there were 1 or 2 billion people and they lived more simpler lives. So my ideal outcome for me would be that we have less people and that they consume less, but I don't think many people would agree with me on that. So again, governments that propose to people that they become less rich, they don't get elected in most countries. They're not very popular. People change them for governments that deliver more material benefits and more rapid economic growth. So I guess I would go for rather an old-fashioned approach, which is to have representative samples of as many different ecosystems as possible in reasonable size protected areas, given good conservation status, and have them embedded within a matrix of less intensively managed areas where more productive uses of the land are made. So these sorts of ideas were expressed quite well in documents 20 or 30 years ago, but nowadays it seems that people don't want to accept the realities of the trade-offs. That you have to make difficult decisions sometimes about what to conserve and what you're not going to be able to conserve. So again, it's a very subjective discussion. It depends on the stage of development of the country. If you're in a country like Canada, where most people are pretty rich and the population is very small, then you really could probably afford to conserve pretty much every species that lives in Canada, and examples of pretty much all the ecosystems. But in countries like South Asia, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, that would be very difficult to achieve, because there are just so many people So you're going to have to make choices. In Europe, of course, we make choices, but we do a lot of our conservation in quite small areas, but they're very carefully and intensively managed. So most biologists think it's really important to have very, very large protected areas. And of course, that's ideal. That would be nice. But in the papers that I asked Susie to put on the web, I argued that that's often not possible, and that you can achieve a lot by having smaller protected areas if they're in the right place and they get the right management and they're hopefully connected up to other areas. So again, the situation varies very much from country to country. Even within China, I mean, the answer would be quite different in different parts of China. So it's an ongoing question. But I do think CBD should discuss those sorts of things and should try and provide us with some targets for what the world should aspire to.
Thank you. Actually, I wanted to add something else. So I see that a lot of people see conservation as protecting what we already have and trying to keep our loss to the minimum. But I've also been thinking that since nature is forever adapting, changing, and evolving sort of system, do you think it is possible for nature, ecosystems, animals, plants to be integrated into our urban cities, settlements, in a way that we can still achieve carbon sequestration and biodiversity, like creating a whole new ecosystem that is not the same as what we had before, but still achieves the ecological services that people want. I know this is a very, very difficult thing to achieve, especially in the foreseeable future, but do you think this is something that people should work towards in addition to conserving already existing pieces of nature? This is my final question. Thank you.
Well, yes, I do agree with you. There's some quite interesting papers that were written a few years ago by Ariel Lugo and others from the US Forest Service on novel forest ecosystems. So they were recognizing that the forest ecosystems that we knew from the past may not be viable in the future. And now with what we know about climate change and invasive species and pathogens and all the diseases we have in the forests in Canada and well, everywhere, that we may, and there's work going on within our faculty here on moving species to places where they're better adapted to the climate. So I do think that we are going to have to manage these systems much more intensively in the future, and that they will not look like what we used to refer to as the sort of climax systems that existed in those places in the past. So we need an awful lot of ecological studies to understand how that change is taking place and what sort of things we can do to steer that change in a positive direction. Again, it's an opportunity. It emphasizes the need to have a lot more well-qualified forest ecologists. And your point about urban forests is interesting too. I live in a part of Vancouver that's got a lot of forest. I have old growth forest right outside the window of this room that I'm sitting in. And I think it's sequestering carbon, but it's got a lot of biodiversity in it. That's why I live here, because I like that. But I've noticed if you go to, say, Jakarta, some of the cities in Asia, that you now see a lot of biodiversity within the cities that you don't see when you go out into the countryside, because the people in the cities tend not to hunt things, and they don't do the things that are bad for biodiversity because they're too busy working in their offices and earning money. So, urban environments, we have a whole urban forestry program at UBC, but urban environments can be rich in biodiversity and certainly can sequester carbon. So yeah, it's a big issue and there's lots of interesting research to be done.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question and answer. Then we have Ranu. Are you there, Ranu? Yes, please.
Yes, So thank you very much for your very informative presentations. So my question is spreading of invasive plant species really threat to the biodiversity and ecosystem in tropical landscape? And also, if it is a major issue, if it is a big issue, what are the approach that you can use to handle or manage such cases? So what is your idea and any examples or any experience with that?
So again, a very interesting question. When I was younger, we all believed that invasive species were really mainly a problem on little islands, and they weren't a problem in continental areas. But that's clearly wrong now, because so many species are moving around the world and getting into new forests, and the climate's changing, and the resistance, hasn't had time to evolve in the systems that have evolved locally. Conditions are changing too fast for those species to be able to adapt. So this was really brought home to me just last month. We were spending some time in Bali in the mountains, up in the hills where there's quite a lot of natural forest, and we were talking to the people from the village, and somebody came to tell us that they were really worried because there was this invasive species getting into the forest on the mountains. And of course, all the water for the rice terraces, for the irrigation, comes from those forests. And these people thought that this invasive species was going to kill all the trees and it would impact on the water supply. So we went with them into the forest, and it was true that there was a climbing plant that was getting into anywhere where there's a light patch, and it was growing up onto the forests, onto the trees, and then the trees eventually were falling over. I didn't know what it was, so I took a photograph and I sent it to one of my colleagues in UBC. And the following day, I had the identification and a whole diagnosis, and it was I can't remember the name now, but it was a plant that originates in Japan, that is a garden plant, and somebody must have brought it to Bali and planted it, and it got into the forest, and it was invading very aggressively, doing a lot of damage. And so then I wondered what on earth you could do about it, because the local people were asking me how they could address this problem. And the only solution I could come up with was that they have to not open up the canopy, because this thing grows when it gets light. But if the canopy is closed, then it doesn't do well. So it was happening where people had opened up a little bit of the canopy to build a track or plant something. But in other places, it wasn't getting around. So you have to look at those sorts of things. That's just one example, but I now see, especially diseases. I mean, you'd think in New Guinea, in remote areas of New Guinea, there'd be no problems of this sort. But up in the mountains of Indonesia and New Guinea, I've come across areas where practically all the notophagus trees have died over huge areas. You can sit on a hilltop and you can see for miles the dead crowns of notophagus trees. And what has happened is that Phytophthora, the potato wilt disease, has come in probably with potatoes. We don't know if it's the same species or a related species, and the notophagus was very susceptible to it, and it's just gone through the entire population. Now, I suppose some trees will be resistant to it, and they will now come to dominate the canopy. But I think we need to be really alert to these things. They're massive problems, which I didn't worry about a few decades ago, but now I do. So obviously you have the examples here of these different beetles that have got into the pines and the cedars and the firs and things like that. And I think we're going to see more of this in the future, because we're going to have more fragmented forests, in some cases more uniform forests because of forest management, and changing climates. And these uniform stands of forests, which foresters in British Columbia like to have. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on invasive species and invasive pathogens. It's going to be a major problem for forest conservation in the future.
Okay, right. Thank you for your answer.
Okay. Do we still have questions from the participants? Okay. If there's no, I would like to conclude the seminar for today. So it's really nice that Professor Sayer shared with us the 5 cases that making us to think about the underground situation for conservation, especially we need to incorporate the people's needs into the conservation. I think that's really something especially for the young students and the young colleagues, young scientists to think about in the future. And we also have a very nice, interesting discussion, which also make this seminar very interesting. And I think I really enjoyed, and I think it does to other participants as well. So it's also the time 10:36 in China now, and I think it's dark already in Canada. And I think this is a really wonderful time we spent together. Thanks for Professor Sayer again, and please join us with your big hands too. Thanks, Professor Sayer. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Yang, and I really appreciated your presence and interest and all the questions. It was very nice to have the chance to talk to you, and thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Thanks for the participants. And hopefully we will have a next seminar very soon, announced by Susie. Okay, bye-bye, everybody. Have a good weekend to all of you. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.